For this third and final installment in this introductory video, we will focus on preventing excessive fatigue and overtraining. One of the biggest challenges for high performance and recreational athletes alike is the ability to regulate their training programs to induce optimal training adaptations. Failure to do so results in either undertraining or overtraining. In response to this requirement, the concept of periodization of training has emerged. The general interpretation of a periodized training program includes a structured approach and a long-term plan for training. However, beyond the general description, a periodized approach to training means different things to different people. Most coaches and athletes agree that a periodized training program has important outcomes, such as reduced risks of injury and a developing symptoms of overtraining, as well as a better chance of attaining peak performances during competition. Although we have covered periodization in other modules in this course, this will be a real quick recap. Although the origin of periodization is often attributed to Russian professor Matveyev, he really just used the term to describe the planning phases of an athlete's training. Despite the debate about nomenclature and nuances of the different phases of a periodized training program, the fundamentals can be reduced to a few concepts. For example, periodization is the process of systematic planning of short and long-term training programs by varying training loads and incorporating adequate rest and recovery. Therefore, it provides a structure for controlling the stress and recovery associated with training, serving as a template for coaches and athletes and providing variation in the training load. A similar training load applied over several days or weeks causes training monotony, which is related to negative adaptations to training. Varying the training load in a planned way reduces the risk of monotony. The basic goals of a periodized program are to apply a training stimulus at optimal times, manage fatigue, and prevent stagnation or overtraining. The main aim is to induce the desired physiological adaptations and the technical and tactical skill associated with peak performance. Although several hundred studies have attempted to gain a deeper understanding about the application of periodized training, most have failed to add much value to what coaches have already been doing. There are several factors that make it difficult to conduct meaningful studies on different aspects of periodization, and these include: firstly, research is primarily applicable to strength power athletes, not team sports. Researchers rarely use athletes as participants. It is more convenient to use students, who are often moderately trained or even untrained. Their rate of adaptation and the ability to recover from a different training load differs from that of elite athletes. The use of volume and intensity, the variables manipulated in most studies, is contentious. Research studies are rarely long enough to elicit long-term training effects. It is very difficult to have good compliance with studies that last several months or even years. Several different models for periodizing training exist. These models differ depending on the sport, but they all share a common principle in having phases of general preparation, specific preparation, competition preparation, competition, and transition or active rest. The terminology for dividing the cycles is as follows. Firstly, you have a macrocycle. This is the long plan, usually about a year in duration. Then it gets broken up into mesocycles, shorter plans from about 2 weeks to several months. And then thirdly, there's the microcycle. These are short plans of usually around 7 days. The time period around these training blocks vary depending on the sport. The annual plan, the macrocycle, is normally designed around the number of competitive phases in a year. For sports that have one competitive phase a year, the year is divided into a preparatory, competitive, and transition or recovery phase. Each phase elicits a specific goal. For example, the preparatory phase is usually in the off or pre-season. It may focus on developing aerobic capacity, muscle hypertrophy, and strength endurance, basic strength, and strength and power. The recovery phase can be a period of complete rest, active rest, or cross-training, with the goal of recovery and regeneration for the next cycle or training. The main periodization models that are regularly cited are called linear, nonlinear, and block periodization. Although we won't discuss these in detail, just briefly, the nonlinear or undulating model is where training loads are varied acutely on a daily and weekly basis. The variation factor in training is particularly emphasized in the non-linear model. The linear model is the more classic method in which training volume is decreased while training intensity is increased as the competitive period approaches. On the other hand, block periodization is a model that has concentrated training loads of about 2 to 6 weeks, which focuses on the consecutive development of physical and technical abilities. In team sports, the demands for planning training are different, presenting coaches with unique challenges. In most sports, it is possible to include the phases of general preparation, specific preparation, pre-competition, and competition, which last the duration of the season. However, a common problem is to determine the appropriate training loads during the competition phase of the season. Using a traditional periodization scheme in team sports can be difficult due to factors including an extended season of competition, multiple training goals, interaction of strength training and conditioning, time constraints imposed by concurrent technical and tactical training, and the effect of the physical stresses from the actual games itself. Monitoring how athletes respond to training is important for the periodized plan to work effectively. High-level human performance requires years of training and careful planning to achieve a peak. Athletes can get to a certain level on talent alone, but careful, well-constructed training is required to move to the next level. The capacity to absorb a training load varies significantly amongst athletes. Even for an individual athlete, the relationship between training load and performance varies over a career and according to the different phases of training. It is clear that the ideal training load for each athlete needs to be carefully individualized. This can not only be achieved by manipulating the training load in response to symptoms of how the athlete is responding to the training program. Without frequent monitoring, athletes may conceivably over or undertrain. To monitor the training status effectively so that the training load can be adjusted accordingly, a few questions should be answered after every training session, such as, how hard did the athlete find the session, the RPE? How did the athlete recover from the session? How is the athlete coping with the cumulative stress of training? Answers to these questions are important for the coach to make informed decisions about whether or not the planned training needs to be modified. The saying, "you cannot manage what you don't measure," is particularly relevant in this context. While it is important to have a training plan, the day-to-day implementation of the plan should not be rigid. Rather, it should be modifiable based on the symptoms of the athlete. Certain tools can be used to gather this information, and the whole process of gathering the information takes only a matter of minutes. A review study by Smith in 2003 set out a comprehensive framework on the components of performance and training that should be addressed when developing short and long-term training plans for elite performance. This review also summarized the most common areas associated with training for high performance. These are summarized as follows. Recovery is often neglected, and mistakes are made in the micro and macro cycle sequences. General exercise sessions are not adequately used for recovery. Demands on athletes are made too quickly relative to capacity, compromising the adaptive process. After breaking training due to illness or injury, the training load is sometimes increased too quickly. High volumes of both maximal and submaximal intensity training are used. The overall volume of intense training is too high when an athlete is primarily engaged in endurance sport. Excessive attention and time are spent in complex technical or mental aspects without allowing adequate recovery phases or downtime. Excessive amount of competitions with maximum physical and psychological demands are combined with frequent disturbances of the daily routine and insufficient training. Training methodology is based with insufficient balance. The athlete lacks trust in the coach due to high expectations or goal setting, leading to frequent performance failure. All these points are related to the concept of periodization, particularly a deviation from the general rules that govern the periodization model. These points can also be described using the theory of the fitness-fatigue relationship. According to this theory, an athlete's readiness for performance is defined by the difference between the two consequences of a training session, fitness and fatigue. Following each training session, a state of fatigue occurs, which is at its greatest immediately after the session, but then decreases with time. Another property referred to loosely as fitness also occurs after each training session. Fitness, which encompasses the benefits of the session, is associated with the acute and more long-term adaptations following the bout of exercise. Fitness benefits decay with time. The readiness for performance gradually increases after the training session, since fatigue dissipates at a faster rate than fitness decays. A window of opportunity will appear, during which readiness for performance is heightened. It is obviously counterintuitive to expose athletes to a hard training session when their levels of fatigue are high, unless the plan is to intentionally induce an early state of overreaching. Any strategies that minimize fatigue or accelerate recovery after training are theoretically beneficial to athletes, since they will accelerate and increase the duration of the readiness for further training and competitive performance. Regular monitoring ensures that coaches are aware of athletes' fitness fatigue state at any stage of training so they can adjust the planned training if necessary. That concludes this video and this 3-part series on the fundamentals of fatigue and recovery and overtraining prevention. Understanding these concepts can help with avoiding symptoms of overtraining. And this should be at the core of our role as an S&C coach. There are so many factors to consider here, and with a solid periodized plan, appropriate management of training loads, select implementation of recovery modalities, and adequate feedback mechanisms to monitor responses to training stresses, we can put the athlete in the best possible position for optimal gains from their training and optimal competitive performance. Thanks for watching.